As I mentioned earlier, I'm Pastor Mike. If you're visiting with us, glad you're here. Um, just so you kind of know a little bit about us. We're not that old of a church. We're like 5 years old, and one of our guys earlier made mention they remember when there was two people on stage leading in worship, and so they've got enough people up here now. I think they're trying to keep me confined. Um, but it's really exciting what God has been doing within this church, especially in the last couple of years. And just the stories, you got to see one of those stories today. There's a lot of other stories of what God is telling, and I believe there's stories that God is telling that are yet to come to fruition. And so myself, I am a native to Cleveland area of Ohio, so go Bucks. Seriously, man. I get no love around here. But I came down here, and it was about 8 years ago, believing that God wanted to do something through a little old group that was meeting in a house called Awaken Church. And it's pretty cool to see how God has allowed those dreams to come to fruition. And, it's really great to see the number of you that are involved in what God is doing here. And, so it's really cool. I myself did not grow up in a church. In fact, one of my first times in a church was Easter Sunday. And it was a guy that a friend of mine in high school invited me to come with him on Easter. And somebody looked at me and they said, "He is risen." And some of you guys that are in church, what do you say? You have a church background. What do you say when somebody says, "He is risen"? He is risen indeed, right? This guy says this to me, and I'm like, Who's risen? What are you talking about? I had no idea. And so he's like, "Oh, well, Jesus is risen. That's why we're here on Easter." I'm like, "Oh, okay." And he says, "When I say he is risen, you say he is risen indeed." And so he is risen. There you go. There you go. You got the same welcome I got. So you're welcome. I want to introduce you to somebody, if I can do that. Her name is Ellie. Ellie actually will turn 70 here in May. She'll tell you that she feels like she has new life, like she's 30 again. She just got a pacemaker, and so that little heart is just ticking away. She got a grandson that will turn 8 on April 15th. Any other birthdays April 15th? There you go. There you go. Her grandson Brandon will turn 8 on April 15th. He lives in Georgia. She lives in eastern PA. And so she misses him greatly, right? Some of you may be grandparents, and your grandkids are away as well, and so you miss them greatly. She, if you were to sit and talk with her, she would share these fond memories of her husband, Ray, who passed away a number of years ago. The fondest memory of all is their first date. She would tell you that the first date they had was he was so nervous that he was trying to flick his cigarette ashes into the ashtray, and he missed and got them on her stockings, and it burned a hole in her stockings. First date. Isn't that fantastic? Some of you think you had a rough first date. She would share with you, she just she has this love for these exotic hats. And she wears these exotic hats because it reminds her of her mom. In fact, she just recently got a hat, and she says, "This reminds me of my mom who passed away again a number of years ago." And she can't handle not buying like 50-cent baskets. Anybody else here a lover and collector of baskets? She just loves to collect baskets. So she sees a cheap basket, she wants to buy it, and she fills it with like crochet stuff and needlepoint stuff and whatever that rest of that stuff is, right? And this Easter, she says, I don't want to fill it with that. She's filled it with candy, and it's sitting out her door. She lives in a condo, and the kids come by, and they can grab the candy. If you were to sit with her, she has fantastic ideas about politics and religion. She would tell you there's no need to vote, okay? In the upcoming election, no need to vote because, excuse me, the royalty of Europe has already decided who's going to win the election. The Queen of the Netherlands, she would say. has already decided through all their oil money who's going to win the election. No, no kidding. She would tell you this. She would tell you, go ahead and vote, though, to see how the count comes out. So, all right. She might get a little bit embarrassed if you bring up, just a couple years ago, she was like floating around on one of those dating websites. And she speaks Portuguese, so this literal like Don Juan from Portugal. He reaches out all the time with X's and O's, right? But, she just loves her grandson. She loves to sit and share stories. She loves her cats. She has a cat named Blackie. Can I be honest with you guys about something? I have no idea who this lady is. Her name's Ellie. I know that. I spent 30 minutes on Facebook and stalked a grandma. So hopefully she's not listening right now. That would be a little weird. I bring that up for a reason, not because I'm a grandma stalker, okay? So you don't have to worry. I bring that up because I think that it would be dangerous for me to assume a couple things. I wanted to start with social, psychology. I wanted to start there because I think that we can often confuse this idea of personal knowledge and impersonal knowledge. Okay? I just spit all this stuff out about this grandma that lives in Eastern PA. And all of it's true. You can go to her Facebook page. You can find all this stuff. She even plays the sixth string to YouTube videos, okay? She would be like if I saw her on the street, I would know who she was because I saw these pictures, right? I would be able to walk up to her and I'd be able to say, hey, how's that crazy feline Blackie? Is Don Juan still flirting with you? I could walk up and I could say, hey, Ellie, it's great to see you. Did all those kids eat that candy? She would probably look back at me and say, somebody help, right? I have an impersonal knowledge of who she is. Now, for me to have a personal knowledge of who she is, hey, Ellie, can we sit down and talk? Maybe we can grab some tea. I don't like tea, but I'll grab tea. She loves tea, by the way. 30 minutes, it's amazing what you can find. And have her share with me, the loss of her husband. Now that there's like an intimate knowledge there, right? Share with me the loneliness she feels at times because her grandkids are all far away. Share with me how April 15th might be a difficult day because she's not going to see Brandon. We could sit around a coffee table and talk for hours. Now I start to know Ellie in a more personal way. I think it's dangerous to believe that we all enter in here and that we all know who this Jesus is in a personal way. I think many of us know who this Jesus is in an impersonal way. And I'm not saying that's even bad. That's where I started. I walked into a church on Easter Sunday. It was like I knew that Jesus rose from the dead. I knew that Jesus died on this cross. I knew that he had like 12 disciples, right? Some of you might even be able to name those 12 disciples, and we're not going to quiz you. You might be able to talk about some of the miracles he performed over those 3 years of his ministry. You might be able to name some of the other peripheral people that we're going to look at here in just a minute. But that doesn't mean that we have a personal knowledge of who Jesus is. It doesn't mean that I've spent time with the Lord and said, God, I need you to teach me who you are. all that means is that somebody has taught me here, and maybe I've spent a little bit time in here, and now I have this impersonal idea of who this divine God is. But I think for us to come to a place of moving from just this impersonal idea of who God is to more of this personal idea of who God is, it comes back to this idea of divine intersections. It comes back to this idea that to look back and see how has God divinely intersected in different places and different seasons of my life. And it's going back into those spaces of saying, God, I think I remember this. Would you shed more light on that now? God, I think you're real, but I'm really not sure. Would you help me better understand? Now, those are kinds of questions that move us into a space where maybe now we start to see this divine intersection that God has been weaving in and out of our lives, I would say, since our birth. I want us to look at Mark 15 today. Mark 15, if you have the scriptures, I'd encourage you to open there, follow along. Maybe jot a few things down. If you don't, we're going to have the verses on the screen. Or there's a Bible app as well that is instructions are in your program for. But Mark 15, verse 1, it says, very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders and teachers of the law and the whole Sanhedrin reached a decision. It says they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Are you the king of the Jews? Asked Pilate. Yes, it is as you say, Jesus replied. And it's the only thing that Jesus would say in this moment. It says the chief priest accused him of many things. So again, Pilate asked him, aren't you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of, and you have no response. But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. Now it was the custom at the feast to release a prisoner whom the people requested. And this bad dude named Barabbas, doesn't that sound like a bad dude's name, right? Barabbas. Barabbas, so don't call your kids Barabbas. A bad man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. So this guy was a hardened criminal. It says, the crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did, which was let one of the prisoners go. And he says, do you want me to release the king of the Jews? Asked Pilate, because to his idea, this guy's done nothing. And they said, knowing it was out of envy that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. And it says, but the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. What shall I do then with the one you call the king of the Jews? And the crowd shouts, crucify him. Why? What crime has he committed? Asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, crucify him. Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. You know, it's interesting what's transpiring here. It's interesting to me. Pilate, you have to understand, in the Judea, in this area, in this region, it was a little part of Rome. And the Roman government could care less about this spot of land. The Roman government could care less about these people. And so what did they do? They put prefects there, which were like governors for like low-class areas, right? You know, the places in the armpit of Rome, the places we don't care about, we'll put like these prefects. Not the high-ranking officials, just these prefects. So who'd they throw there? They throw Pilate. So Pilate gets thrown into this area. The Roman government is probably hoping they can forget who Pilate is. There's a reason you take Pilate and throw him into the armpit of Rome, okay? Now, Pilate, on the other hand, I'm sure this guy had a desire to move up into Roman politics. Why else would you try to be appeasing the crowd Why else would you try to be ruling great there, try to stifle down this insurrection that's happening among these Jewish people? Why would you do that if he doesn't want to rise into political authority in Rome? And so it's interesting to me that here you have a guy, Pilate, and you have Jesus, and you have this dichotomy taking place. You know, Jesus was a mighty king who chose to be a prisoner for our freedom. Pilate, on the other hand, had a desire to be king, but found himself a prisoner. I want you to catch that. Jesus, our mighty king, chose to be a prisoner. Pilate, on the other hand, wanted to be king and found himself a prisoner. We desire to be a part of something bigger than ourselves, don't we? Any of you guys like compulsive with the television? You'll watch like 2 or 3 things at a time? Anybody? Yeah, you're out there. Last weekend, I was trying to watch 2 basketball games at one time. I wanted to see the Cleveland Cavaliers and how they played the Miami Heat, right? There's a lot of revenge that's got to happen there, fellas, right? And so my boy LeBron was getting his butt smacked. They were getting crushed by the Miami Heat. And so any of you like emotional sports fans? Be honest, you're emotional sports fans. Like my father-in-law, because I'm not going to talk about me, come on. My father-in-law is an avid Browns fan. In case you don't know, the Cleveland Browns are actually part of the NFL. You never hear about them, but they're part of the NFL. They're not a minor league team, okay? So he's an avid Browns fan. And when they start doing poorly, he yells at the television. Anybody else here, you're an emotional sports fan? Yeah. And so I'm sitting here and I'm watching the Cavs get their butts handed to them by the Heat. And I feel this, I think it was like a Friday night, and I feel this like tension rising up in me, right? And I'm like, I got to turn this channel, otherwise I'm going to be like miserable the rest of the night, right? And so later on, an hour later, the Spurs and the Warriors were playing. And so I turned to the Spurs and Warriors because the friend of your enemy is your enemy's worst enemy, right? And so I'm on the television. I'm rooting for the Spurs because the Warriors last year got in our way. And so I'm rooting for the Spurs. And I'm like going back and forth between both of these games. I'm following it like on Twitter. Anybody, right? You're watching one, you're following another on Twitter. And just trying to understand what's going on, right? Well, some of you may not be NBA fans. You might be college basketball fans. Anybody college basketball fans? This is like the best time of the season, right? 64 teams go at it head-to-head. Now we're down to the Final Four next weekend, right? Come on, you guys. And so, something amazing happened in this tournament, though. There's this team called Michigan State. Not the other team. I can't say their name. I'm a Buckeye fan. Michigan State, okay? Michigan State was slotted as a 2 seed. The first round, they play a 15 seed, okay? Now, there's certain games in that tournament, they're just a wash. Everybody knows who's going to win. 20% of the people picked Michigan State to win the whole tournament, not that game, the whole tournament. They lost. And you know what's funny? The commentators are like, oh my goodness, where in the world is Middle Tennessee? That's who they played. I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, I don't know, Middle Tennessee. Not Illinois. Not you know what? I think it's in Middle Tennessee, right? Where in the world is Middle Tennessee? Everybody's amazed and surprised that Middle Tennessee knocked off Michigan State. You know what was amazing was not the players crying in the postgame. Some of you ladies are laughing. Come on. Emotional. It's not that the coach was weeping with his players. It's that the fans who weren't even in the game are crying. Now, see, I'm from like the Cleveland area. We don't cry. We just burn things when things don't go our way. Okay? We just burn things. No joke. Look it up. I'm always going to shoot you straight. You know, it's amazing. We invest ourselves into these things, even from the couch, because we desire to be a part of something bigger than ourselves. Hundreds of thousands of people are rooting for these teams, and we desire to be a part of something bigger than ourselves. I think the same thing's true for Pilate. I think Pilate desired to be a part of something bigger than himself, and he found himself trying to build his own kingdom in the process. And here he is trying to become king, and he's got the king standing right in front of him. And instead of accepting that the king's standing in front of him, he becomes a prisoner of his own desire to be a part of something bigger than himself. You know, we can read through this kind of impersonally, and we can forget that the people in here were real people like you and I, and that the people in here actually had emotion and showed emotion. I think Pilate was one of those guys like all of you and I that had a desire to be a part of something more than himself. And somewhere along the lines, he got lost in that process. It continues, you know, I believe that I was Pilate at one time, and Jesus divinely intersected with me. And then it continues, and it says, you know, there were soldiers that led Jesus away into the palace and called together the whole company of soldiers. It says they put purple robes on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, the King of the Jews." And it goes on, it says they mocked him. They mocked him. I think we mock those things that we don't understand, right? I think it's easy for us to mock something we just don't comprehend. And can I have like self-confession time to you? There are seasons, there are situations where it's easy for me to make a fool of myself. I know that might be astounding to some of you. There are seasons where my wife reminds me that I can make a fool of myself. And so, like literally, I'm going to ask my buddy to come up here. He doesn't even know this. Adrian, would you come here? He's like right in here. He's like taking notes. And I can do this because I like really know this guy. This guy loves me. I love him, right? Thanks, man. Thanks. See, you know, it's nothing. I'll come up. I'll give him a hug. I like to hug people, right? Yeah, and see, yeah, right? I'm a hugger, yeah. Now, it'd be a little bit awkward if I came up and said, "Hey, bro." You know, he's a little nervous right now, isn't he, right? Now, some of you guys aren't going to want to get to know me because that's like free license. Hey, man, won't you come on up here, right? You can sit down, thanks. Yeah. Isn't this guy great? Yeah, there you go. Give him a round. There you go. You know, I like to, you know, I might see in the lobby, you know, I'll be like, "Hey, how you doing?" It's like that half bro hug, right? And so there was one of my children, mini children. She was going into preschool, and I've shared this maybe off and on a little bit here and there. Great illustration. I recognized the preschool teacher from another year of school, and this was her first year teaching this preschool. And so I walked up and I was like, "Hey, how you doing?" I gave her a hug, you know, like a half hug, not the awkward hug, the half hug, right? And my wife told me, she's told me for the last 2 years, she says, the lady, her eyeballs just popped out of her head. She's like, "What is this guy doing," right? And Connie standing right there was like, "Hey, I'm so glad you're teaching my kid this year," right? And I never believed Connie. I was like, "No, she was fine." Until I saw her last week, and she wouldn't make eye contact with me at the other school. I was like, "Oh, I must have embarrassed her," right? And so, you know, and then I was out running last week, and you're like running along, and somebody drives by, and if you're running like me, you're like just trying to breathe and stay alive. And so I'm running, and like a van comes passing by. And I look, and it was like, hey, I recognize that van. But there's like a ton of Dodge Caravans, right? And so I'm like, they come driving by, and it's a young lady driving this van, and I got this smile on my face. I'm like, and I'm running trying to keep my breath, and so I don't like wave or anything, and then I'm like, I don't know if that's who I thought it was. And, that I think it was somebody that's here, but I don't know if it was or not. And so I'm hoping you come up to me after and say, oh, yeah, I saw you running last week. Otherwise, yeah, I gave a creepy smile to some strange lady driving by. And so it's easy for me to get into those places where I can make a mockery of myself. But I believe it's in those places that Jesus can divinely intersect in my life and can show me and teach me things about who I really am. You see, because we tend to either mock something that we don't understand, or it's easy to get ourselves in situations where we become an item of that mockery. And I believe that it's in those spaces that Jesus can divinely intersect with us and show us some things about who he truly is. I don't think it's a coincidence that Jesus allowed his life to intersect with those that were mocking him, with these soldiers who completely didn't understand who he was. You see, I was these soldiers at one time, and Jesus divinely intersected with my life. You continue reading the story, and you see that Jesus now intersects with a man named Simon. It says, a certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Don't name your son Rufus. Was passing by on his way in from the country, and it says they forced him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Here's a man, Simon, who's just going about his day. Have you guys ever just gone about your day and somebody has to rudely interrupt? I was running, right? And I know it's a surprise. I was running, and somebody stops me for directions. Yeah, some of you guys that have run, you're like, you don't do that, right? But have you ever been just going about your day and something just totally takes and shifts you somewhere else? Here's a man, Simon, just going about his day. He doesn't even live in the area. He's got his 2 sons with him. They're probably coming into the city to the marketplace to get some things to take back to the house, right? And the next thing he knows is he's carrying Jesus' cross. You ever felt like you're just going about your day and all of a sudden you get pulled into somebody else's mess? Simon is going about his day, and before he knows it, he's pulled into somebody else's mess. Has no idea what's going on. All he knows is crowds are shouting, people are mocking, and here's a man who's beat and battered, has struggled all night, and is now trying to carry this cross up a hill. And it says they forced Simon to come in and take the cross. You know what's interesting? If you look in Romans, a book here in the scriptures, or another book, Acts, you actually see Simon and his 2 sons mentioned. And you don't see them coming into town to get groceries. You see them actually sharing about this king named Jesus. And so this divine intersection that takes this man totally away from what he had planned for that day was probably the best thing that ever happened in his life. So many of us may be here, and you're here because somebody like dragged you here, right? I don't think it's a coincidence. I don't think it's by accident. I don't think it's by chance. I think that God is divinely intersecting within our lives as we sit here. The question is, will I pause, as I believe Simon did? Will I pause and say, Jesus, show me what you're doing? God, if you're real, and I don't even know if you're real, would you show me what you're doing? Now, there's others of us sitting here. There's a guy that you can go on. You see this guy named Joseph of Arimathea. And verse 43, it says, Joseph, a prominent member of the council who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. He goes and he says, Pilate, I want the body of this Jesus. And he wraps him in linen. He pays for the burial of this man, Jesus. But it says that Joseph was waiting for the coming of God's kingdom. So that tells me that Joseph had an idea who God was. It tells me that Joseph knew God personally, not impersonally. You know, I look at Pilate, he knew who Jesus was impersonally. The mockers, they knew who Jesus was impersonally, right? And then you look at this man, you know, Simon, I think, knew who Jesus was impersonally, but something changed in that divine moment, in that divine intersection that caused Simon to now know who Jesus was personally. But here is Joseph, who already knew who Jesus was personally. But you know what I find amazing in this passage? Is that Joseph spends all kinds of money to bury Jesus. That tells me Joseph didn't understand totally what God was up to. Why would you spend all this money to bury somebody that's going to raise 3 days later? That tells me that we can sit here and follow who God is and say, God, I want to know you personally, but also say, God, there are a lot of things I just don't understand. Because it shows me that Joseph was a man who followed Jesus personally, but there are a lot of things he just didn't understand. I'm here to tell you that I am that Joseph. And that God intersected with my life in a divine way some 15, 20 years ago. Some of it interrupted. God, I'm going about my stuff here, and you got to come along and interrupt. And I can tell you that now today I'm Joseph, and I follow God intimately, personally, but there are a lot of things that he does that I don't understand. As the band comes up and continues to lead us in the last song to worship, I want you to think through to yourself, who are you within this story? Are you Pilate? You're just trying to go about your life and be a part of something bigger than yourself, and maybe you're getting lost within that. Maybe you're getting lost within that. And you find that you're a prisoner to your own kingdom that you're trying to create and build. I was that guy. I was that guy in college. God was allowing me to build this kingdom. I had a career path all set out for me. And then I found myself a prisoner to the very thing that I thought was going to save me. I was Pilate. But then there were other seasons where God has put me in places that I just didn't understand. Where God was putting me in the situations where God was, you know, it just seems like I was being made a fool of. You see, I was those mockers. There were times where I just looked at God and I don't know who God is. Are you kidding me? I have no interest in that. See, I was those mockers because I didn't understand. But it was within that vulnerability that God intersected with my life. Maybe some of you are sitting here and maybe you are Simon and you're just going about your day and somebody says, hey, part of your day, I want you to come with me. And you find yourself sitting here. And you're like, I don't know if I know who God is. I'm just going about my thing. I just want to say I don't think you're here by accident. It's one of the things that I've loved about what God has created here. Is a place that God has allowed all of us to intersect in all kinds of different places within our pursuit of this divine being. Some of us can put a name to him, Jesus, and others of us don't have a name yet. My hope is, though, that one day we become Joseph. We may not totally understand everything that God is doing. Sometimes, I think it'd be easier to follow God if we didn't have to live life, right? Because things just happen in life. And we're like, God, what are you doing? But you know what? I think it's the very life that God intersects and intertwines within our lives. I think it's within the community that we sit here today that God intersects and intertwines within our relationships. And I think he leads us along that path of being able to one day say, Jesus, I don't know if I totally understand everything that you're doing. But Jesus, I do believe that you're real. I do believe that we sit here. I do believe that we have freedom because of your death and resurrection some 2,000 years ago. And Lord, I want to know you in a personal way, not an impersonal way. If that's you today, I would encourage you to talk with one of us, or I would encourage you just to say, Jesus, I need to know that you're real. And if you're not sure, just ask him and he'll tell you. I truly believe that because I asked one day and he told me. Lord Jesus, I thank you for how you intersect in our lives. Lord, I thank you that we are not here by accident or by chance. Jesus, I thank you that the relationships that we have in our lives are not by accident or by chance. And Lord, I truly believe that you are pursuing each one of us. And Jesus, I truly believe that if we were to stop and to look back, that we would see you divinely intersecting within our lives. And so, Jesus, I pray that as we leave here today, whether we're Pilate, whether we're the mockers, whether we're Simon, whether we are Joseph, Lord, I pray that you would have us to pause and to say, Jesus, show me a little bit more of who you are today and lead me more into belief. Lead me more into faith and trust.